The history of House Targaryen is most often told through fire. Yet within that history, there is something else, something as old as fire itself, waiting. That long, unseen tension in the halls of the throne, in the silence of stone walls, in chambers made heavy by the breath of kings, where men wait for a name to be born, for an heir to be chosen, for a destiny to step forward. For some children are not born merely into a family, they are born into an age. From their very first breath, they are loved, watched, weighed. Their laughter is received like a promise, and even their silences are filled with meaning. And no matter how radiant they may seem, the childhood of dynasties is never wholly innocent. Over every life raised too near a crown, a shadow moves long before it is ever given a name. Rhaenyra Targaryen, too, was born into such a shadow. Her name first rang out like a joy within the court. The daughter of King Viserys, the little princess carrying the blood of old Valeria, the young face that brought a kind of warmth to the gazes moving about the Iron Throne. But the love of dynasties is often the most graceful trap that fate can set, for the admiration given to a child may one day become the very thing that lays the weight of a kingdom upon her shoulders. To be beloved is not the same as being chosen, least of all when that choice is made in the heart of a world men have, for centuries, believed to be theirs by right. Then love quietly gives way to doubt, smiles become oaths, and oaths deep within the heart do not always mean loyalty. Tonight, we walk together toward that old name that once echoed through the stone halls of Westeros, toward the story of a princess who carried the warmth of fire, yet could never wholly escape the cold of fate. If you are ready, lower your voice, set down a little of the day's burden from your shoulders, and surrender yourself to the slow, heavy current of history in this long night. From where are you listening to this story? From what city, what room, what silence, and what hour is it where you are? Perhaps the night beyond your window has already deepened, or perhaps in some other corner of the world, the last light has not yet gone out. Wherever you are, tonight I invite you into that old shadow settling over the lands of the crown, into the torch-lit corridors, into those high chambers where the sea wind strikes the stone towers, into the quiet fate of a girl growing between a father's love and a kingdom's reluctance. For some stories do not begin with war, some begin with a birth, and from the very first day, they already carry their ending within them. Rhaenyra Targaryen came into the world of King Viserys I in an age where splendor and weariness were bound tightly together. To outward eyes, these were still years in which peace seemed to stand unbroken, in which order was preserved around the Iron Throne, and in which dragons still crossed the skies as reminders of the dynasty's power. After the Great Council, the crown had passed to Viserys, and in the wake of Jaehaerys' long reign, the realm had allowed itself to believe, for a time, that peace would endure. On the surface, the court was calm, ceremonies were held, alliances were maintained, noble houses knew their duties, and the king's gentle manner seemed almost to have taken the place of severity. Yet, the deepest fractures of dynasties are rarely prepared upon battlefields. More often, they are shaped at family tables and in birth chambers. And the world of Viserys stood upon just such a fragile stillness, beautiful, wide, radiant, and no less fleeting for it. At the center of this world, in her earliest years, Rhaenyra rose like a radiant promise. The court loved her not only because she was the king's daughter, but because of the brightness she carried around her. That young princess who joined graceful childhood to the pride of dragon blood, who spoke well and looked upon the world with fearless eyes, soon came to be called the realm's delight. The title was more than a courtesy. Her presence truly did seem to bring a kind of lightness to the court. Amid gold and crimson, black stone and formal faces, she reminded people of something they had forgotten, that even within dynasties, simple joy could sometimes still be born. Rhaenyra was loved because eyes turned toward her at feasts, because she could stand with confidence before lords, because even in childhood she carried a striking nobility. Yet within that sweet title, fragility was already hidden from the beginning. For the realm might love a girl, it might applaud her, it might even admire her deeply, but whether it truly wished for her to rule was another matter entirely. Behind that brightness, however, stood a darker truth. In Viserys's world, what was most desired was still a male heir. The life of Queen Aemma Arryn had become one of those quiet tragedies courts so dearly love, remembered as a beautiful, noble, and gentle queen, while her body was tested again and again for the sake of the dynasty's hope. Rhaenyra passed her childhood watching that narrow line between her mother's grace and her mother's fragility. And then, one day, all the splendor of courtly order lost its meaning at the door of a birthing chamber. Aemma gave her life while bringing forth the son the realm had long awaited. The newborn child, Balon, was seen for a brief moment as the answer to the future. But the answer did not endure for long. The infant, too, did not survive. And so, in a single day, the House of Viserys lost both its queen and the long-awaited male heir. That death was not merely the grief of a family. In that moment, the course of the future changed as well. There was mourning in the court, yes, but deeper than the mourning was the question of what might fill the place that had been left empty. For Viserys, that question was as personal as it was political. For the death of Aemma was not only the loss of the woman he had loved, but also the end of a hope he had long carried in silence. And at the center of that ending stood Rhaenyra. Only days before, she had been a beloved little princess. Suddenly, she found herself face to face with the exposed future of the dynasty. The light of childhood did not vanish, perhaps, but for the first time, a grave, cold, and irreversible shadow fell across it. That is why King Viserys's decision to name her heir was not merely a political act. It was a heavy choice, woven of regret, love, defiance, and fear all at once. In a world where the precedence of men was treated as almost natural, the king upon the Iron Throne set his own daughter before all others. The lords were summoned, oaths were sworn, knees bent, hands were raised, names were spoken. The great houses of Westeros gave their word that they would recognize Rhaenyra Targaryen as the rightful heir to the throne after Viserys. From the outside, history seemed to have clarified itself in that moment. It was as though a king had spoken, the realm had listened, and the matter had been closed. But the most dangerous silences in history often come after moments such as these. For the oaths men swear before the world are often not enough to overcome the older habits buried in the heart. For Rhaenyra, that declaration was as much the beginning of a burden as it was an ascent. What was given to her was not merely a title. She was also handed an unseen war against centuries of belief in male succession. Her approach to the Iron Throne did not make her safer. On the contrary, it made her someone more closely watched, more easily judged, and more deeply surrounded by doubt. For when a male heir committed some fault, men often assumed the future was still his by right. But for a female heir, even the slightest shadow was enough to awaken the whole question of legitimacy once more. Rhaenyra may not yet have had the words to name this fully in childhood, and yet she could feel that hesitation moving through the air of the court. Not every head that bowed before her did so with the same sincerity. Not every tongue that praised her name spoke from the same loyalty. Some men were bowing only to the command of a king. In their hearts, they remained on the side of an older world. That is why even Viserys's love did not lighten her fate. It only made it more meaningful and more sorrowful. The king had begun to see in his daughter not merely his child, but the continuation of his house. He no longer thought of her only as the joy of the court, but as the future of the throne itself. And that change both strengthened and burdened the bond between father and daughter. For Viserys was not merely promising Rhaenyra a crown. He was entrusting her with the task of standing at the center of the storm that would come after him. There is love within such a trust, but there is no peace in it. In some tellings, one of the quietest and heaviest moments in that intimate bond comes when Viserys whispers to his daughter the ancient secret, Aegon's dream, that dark prophecy foretelling that ice and fire would one day stand against one another again, and that the Targaryen throne was meant to bear not only power, but the duty of protection as well. If that burden was truly passed to Rhaenyra, then her father's choice of her as heir was not merely part of worldly politics. It was the handing over of a deeper, older, nobler charge. The throne was to be preserved not only in order to rule, but in order to keep the realm standing against the darkness yet to come. And yet, even such a secret carried its own sorrow. It could not be shown to others. It could not be proclaimed in public squares or used to silence the doubts of lords. It was a trust that outwardly resembled a crown, but inwardly carried solitude. If Rhaenyra truly heard those words from her father's lips that night, she must have left that chamber not as a princess, but as someone newly bound to the unseen chain of history. And yet, whether the prophecy was true or not, the deeper truth did not change. The realm never wholly accepted her. It behaved as though it had. It raised cups in her honor. It spoke her name in ceremony. In her early years, it praised her beauty, her dignity, the bearing that seemed so worthy of dragon blood. But behind all that praise, an older way of thinking, resistant to change, continued to live on. The idea of succession through men is preserved less by law than by habit, and habit can at times be harder than steel. Even when Rhaenyra's name was spoken as heir, many still saw it not as a final order of the world, but as a passing exception, as though fate would one day take male form again, and history would return to its older road And so the early years of Rhaenyra were shaped within a rare kind of duality, brightness and unrest. She truly had become a beloved princess, yet at the same time, she had stepped into a world where being loved was not enough. The future promised to her was magnificent, yes, but the stones of that magnificence had been laid with cracks from the very beginning. A crown had been extended toward her, certainly, but within the same kingdom, the hands that offered it and the thoughts that quietly wished to draw it back were still living side by side. It is here, upon this narrow and painful threshold, that the story of Rhaenyra Targaryen truly begins. The story of a girl chosen in the eyes of a king, loved in the heart of a father, raised up as the bright face of a dynasty, and yet from the very first day, silently made the subject of doubt when it came to her right to rule. The war had not yet begun. The banners had not yet been raised. The dragons had not yet taken to the sky in fury, and the corridors of the court had not yet heard the full voice of betrayal. But the fracture was already there, and some fractures at first glance seem no more than a thin line. Then they split an entire kingdom in two. Within that first brightness surrounding Rhaenyra's childhood, there had once also been friendship, a closeness rare within the stone walls of the court, formed not in the language of politics, but in the sincerity of youth. Alicent Hightower was not, at first, a rival to her, but a familiar face, a safe voice, a companion with whom she shared the same corridors and the same long days. Both had grown beneath the heavy air of the Red Keep, moving toward youth through kings, feasts, councils, and silences. But in courts, friendship is seldom left to its own fate. It is not given room. It is not given time. And when the loneliness of a king reaches into the life of a young girl, a shadow falls across that friendship as well, one not easily lifted again. After the death of Queen Aemma, the emptiness that appeared around Viserys was not only the loss of a wife, it was an absence in the order of the court itself, in the circle nearest the throne, unseen yet felt by all. That emptiness did not remain empty for long. Slowly, the king turned toward a quiet closeness that offered him comfort, and that closeness bore a name drawn from within Rhaenyra's own childhood. Alicent was no longer only a friend. She was becoming a figure summoned to the king's chambers, a companion to his grief, a presence whose voice and calm brought softness into the days of a weary ruler. That transformation must have been felt even before it was ever spoken aloud, for a court often hears what is left unsaid before it hears what is declared. Glances begin to change, silences grow longer, an invisible coldness settles between two people standing in the same room, and one day it becomes clear that what was once friendship now survives only as memory. Viserys' marriage to Alicent Hightower could, from the outside, be seen as a natural decision suited to the needs of the realm and meant to strengthen the order of the court. A king had been left widowed, and for the continuation of the dynasty, it was expected that he would marry again. The survival of the line, the stability of the court, new alliances, new hopes, all these were old reasons that could lend legitimacy to a ruler's choice. Yet the deepest wounds in history are often opened within the most reasonable decisions. For this marriage did not merely strengthen a house close to the throne. It placed at the center of Rhaenyra's life a girl who had once stood beside her as a friend, and who now, as queen, carried within the orbit of the crown the possibility of another future. For a young girl, this was not only a change in the order of the court. It must have felt like love itself being moved elsewhere. And some wounds do not begin with spoken words, but with a closeness that can never again return to what it once was. Then Aegon was born, and his birth carried a meaning far greater than the ordinary joy that echoes through nursery chambers. For the realm did not regard the coming of a male child merely as a family happiness. It was inclined to receive such a birth as the confirmation of order, the return of tradition, the restoration of the accustomed line of succession. Viserys had named his daughter Heir. The lords had bent the knee to her, accepted her name, and sworn themselves after her. But now the king had a son, and that single truth was enough to cast a new shadow over the oaths that had been made years before. The court did not say so openly at once, not yet, but the thought had already been born, and as the boy grew, so too did the whisper. For some claims return not first as law, but as habit. For Rhaenyra, the true poison began here, not in open defiance, but in that long sickness of the court, where everything is spoken only halfway, and the real sentence is never fully completed. When she entered a room now, she was no longer seen only as the beloved daughter of the king. She had also become one possibility standing before another. Her presence began to be read alongside Aegon's. Whenever one name was spoken, the shadow of the other seemed to enter the hall as well. And in such an atmosphere, a person must learn not only how others look upon her, but how she must carry her own face. Rhaenyra learned this too. The open, effortless joy of childhood slowly withdrew, and in its place came a bearing more guarded, more watchful, less easily wounded. For the court teaches an heir not only splendor, but also a caution learned too early. Her change was not sudden. It moved more like dampness seeping into stone. Feelings that could once be spoken openly were now kept within. Trust drew itself into a narrower circle, and every smile became a little more measured, every word a little more calculated. The distance growing between her and Alicent advanced in much the same way, not as a single moment of rupture, but as the sum of many small coldnesses gathered over time. They no longer saw the same things, nor carried the same silences with the same meaning. The children of one cast a shadow over the future of the other. The dignity of one seemed to contain the claim of the other, and every small ceremony at court appeared to take shape around two invisible centers. And the Red Keep revealed once again a habit as old as its stones. That veil of formal courtesy which forces people to grow wary of one another long before open enmity begins. And that was the deadliest part of all, for hatred had hidden itself within politeness before it had yet taken its own name. Rhaenyra's marriage to Rhaenyra Targaryen took place beneath this same heavy air. It was not merely a union joining the fates of two young people. It was a noble arrangement meant to close the wounds of the dynasty, to draw the great house of the seas back toward the throne, and to quiet political imbalance, if only for a time. The blood of Velaryon and the blood of Targaryen were being placed side by side once more. Old grievances were outwardly being mended, and the realm was presented with the face of harmony. Feasts may have been held, oaths sworn, and torches lit, but in such marriages, the brightness of ceremony does not always illuminate the silence of private life. A court loves to display wholeness to the world outside. Within, each person goes on living the truth from his own corner. And yet this marriage opened for Rhaenyra, at least in outward form, a new chapter that seemed to strengthen her position. She was no longer only the king's heir, but a princess joined to a powerful house, a figure beginning to establish a line of her own. Then her sons were born, Jacaerys, Lucerys, and Joffrey. In a mother's arms, they were at first only children, breathing, growing, beloved, and protected little lives. But courts look even upon cradles through the eyes of politics. Before a child has even learned his own name, men begin to speak of which bloodline his face resembles, the color of his hair, the shape of his nose, the line of his gaze. All are measured against the legitimacy of a dynasty. And it was here, at this very point, that the silent poison of the Red Keep took on a new form. At first, the whispers surrounding Rhaenyra's sons may have seemed like nothing more than the coarse curiosity carried by a few tongues. But at court, curiosity, if it serves those who find advantage in it, turns very quickly into suspicion, and suspicion in turn soon hardens into a system, a weapon, a habit. The children's appearance, the claim that they bore none of Laenor's face, the low-voiced murmur gathering around the name of Harwin Strong, all of it grew over time until the truth itself nearly ceased to matter. For gossip does not always defeat truth. Sometimes it simply becomes independent of it. People begin to carry something as though it were real, not because they truly believe it, but because hearing it again and again gives them a dark kind of comfort. That was what happened at court. Open accusation was rare, but implication was everywhere, and in a place where implication is repeated without end, even silence takes a side. Rhaenyra did not bow before those whispers. She could not. To step back would have meant surrendering not only her own honor, but the future of her children, their rights, and the whole claim of her succession. And so, pride became her armor. She held her head high, presented her sons as true princes, neither confessing what she did not confess, nor sanctifying in her own words the argument the court had opened against her. Yet for a person to know she is in the right does not mean she is left unwounded. Often the wound cuts deeper for that very reason, for the silence born with honor hides the weariness gathering within. Rhaenyra was forced into silence more and more often, but that silence was not surrender. It was something colder than that, something lonelier. It was the inward withdrawal of a princess who, while defending her children beneath the weight of every gaze around her, was slowly drawing away from the court itself. On Alicent's side, another kind of resolve was hardening. The queen was a mother who wished to protect the future of her own children, yet the court saw in her not only motherhood, but the center of another possibility. And so the distance between the two women was no longer merely the loss of an old friendship. It was two bloodlines, two visions of the future, and two different maternal fears facing one another. And between them, there was often no shouting quarrel at all. Something more dangerous took its place. The coldness of ceremony, the measured sentences spoken at table, a life lived beneath the same roof, yet never truly shared. Poison is not always poured into cups. Sometimes it simply seeps into the air. And so the Red Keep was slowly becoming something else. The unease once felt behind songs and feasts had now settled into the fabric of daily life itself. Footsteps echoed through the corridors. Servants kept their heads bowed. Lords spoke the same words at different tables, with different meanings, and every birth, every betrothal, every small event was read as though it were the prelude to a great war of succession. As open speech diminished, whispers grew stronger. Men learned to shape the truth behind curtains rather than proclaim it in the square. And in such a court, the deepest corruption begins not when the sword is drawn, but while it is still in the sheath. The second season of Rhaenyra's youth passed within this silent decay, in the years when the emptiness left by her mother's death was overshadowed by the rise of a new queen, when friendship turned into distance, distance into mistrust, and mistrust into the settled poison of court life. The open rupture had not yet come. The realm had not yet fully begun its march toward the catastrophe that would one day bear its name. And yet everyone could feel that something had changed beyond recall. For sometimes the fall of a dynasty begins not when the drums begin to sound, but when those gathered in the same hall no longer believe in one another. And in the Red Keep, belief was slowly beginning to die. After those long years of whispers that had poisoned life at court, Rhaenyra's gradual withdrawal from the Red Keep began to seem less like flight than the heavy logic of fate itself. For some places, after a time, cease to be made only of walls and corridors. They become the sum of the gazes leaning down upon a person, of sentences left unfinished, of tongues speaking the same name each day in a slightly different tone. And for her, the lands of the crown had become such a place. Those stone chambers that had once been the bright halls of her childhood now resembled a court of judgment, where with every step her legitimacy was weighed anew, and where her motherhood, her honor, her children, and her future were all placed under question at once. And no one can live forever in a place where she must defend herself every day. After a certain point, even breath itself becomes political. That is why Dragonstone became for Rhaenyra more than merely the traditional seat of the heir. It became a deeper kind of refuge, the ancient stronghold of House Targaryen, rising from the sea with its narrow stone bridges, its salt-heavy winds, its black towers, and its cold, dragon-shaped silhouette, carried a truth altogether different from that of the Red Keep. There was less of the court's polished courtesy there. The voice of the sea was more honest, and the loneliness of the rock more plain. It was a place nearer to the roots of the dynasty, one that recalled not so much the splendor of power as its bare and ancient frame. For Rhaenyra, this change was not merely a matter of distance in space. It was the turning of an heir from being the king's daughter beneath his shadow into someone trying to establish a center of her own. That center was not peaceful, but at least it was no longer left to the mercy of others. The winds of Dragonstone also brought another bond in her life into sharper relief. Daemon Targaryen. Daemon had long been a figure too large for the order of the court, a prince who carried not only power, but restlessness as well. Brilliant, dangerous, wounded, and openly bearing within himself all the excess the rest of the dynasty tried to suppress. Between him and Rhaenyra, there had always existed a bond, reaching back into earlier years, living at times in glances, and at other times in those absences whose weight could be felt even more keenly. That bond never wholly vanished through the court's tensions, through marriages, estrangements, scandals, and deaths. On the contrary, the more everything else unraveled, the more inevitable it began to seem. For some people are drawn to one another not because they bring peace, but because they come out of the same fire. That is why their union cannot be read merely as a love story. There was desire in this marriage. Yes, there was the call of blood, the knowledge of a shared loneliness, and the understanding that together they seemed stronger than apart. But beyond all this, there was also a darker sense of necessity, one deeply suited to the fate of a dynasty folding inward upon itself. In one sense, the marriage of Rhaenyra and Daemon was a return to the inner logic of Targaryen history itself, the children of the same fire turning back toward one another against the uncertainty of the world beyond. Yet, such returns do not always bring comfort. Sometimes, they only reveal how deep the fracture truly runs. For when a dynasty must gather its strength from within itself, it often means the world around it has already begun to close in. This marriage brought no peace to the Red Keep. On the contrary, it made the lines that had already been hardening in silence far more visible. The two factions that would come to be called the Blacks and the Greens had not appeared in a single moment. They were the clearer faces of years of swelling doubt, of disputes over succession, of maternal fears, dynastic ambitions, and the careful caution of the court. What had once been only the language of colors, of who sat at which table at feasts, of whose gaze slipped away from whom, had now deepened into something far more profound. Men no longer carried only opinions, they carried allegiance. And in courts, allegiance is often harder than reason. When one name is spoken, a side is summoned with it. When a child is born, it is added not only to a family, but to a future war as well. In this sense, the life Rhaenyra and Daemon built upon Dragonstone was not a separate court, but the other center of the coming division. There, children were growing, new bonds were being forged, loyalties were taking shape, and one branch of the dynasty was closing more tightly around itself. In the Crown lands, meanwhile, Alicent's children were coming of age. Other lords were making other calculations, and other mothers were nursing other fears. Thus, the same dynasty came to breathe in two different ways. One upon the black stone facing the sea, the other beneath the very shadow of the Iron Throne. And that was the bitterest thing of all. The enmity was not coming from beyond. There were no foreign banners rising at the borders, no old rebellion dividing the realm in two. The fracture was rising out of the family's own blood. The House of Dragons was nursing, with its own hands, the silence that would one day tear it apart from within. Throughout all those years, the only true center that still remained standing was Viserys himself. But the king was no longer the ruler of those earlier days, with their gentle ease and smiling calm. Time had eaten into his body, and illness had begun, little by little, to draw him out of the visible world. The man who had once sat easily at feasts, walked the yards with comfort, and looked upon his daughter with warmth, was becoming the king of a pain, turning slowly to bone, of a body falling into ruin, of steps grown ever heavier. At times, the crown he wore seemed less the emblem of rule than a burden draining away the last remnants of his strength. The court saw him weakening. His children saw it, The Lord saw it, Rhaenyra saw it as well, and everyone, even if few dared to speak it aloud, knew the same thing in the quiet of their own hearts. What still held the realm together was no longer law, no longer love, not even fear. It was only the fact that the king was still alive. This is one of the saddest forms of a ruler's power, for in a world over which Viserys could command less and less, he had become, by his mere existence, the last pillar holding the order upright. So long as he still drew breath, men chose silence, delay, and waiting. The old oaths were not entirely forgotten. The new claims were not yet fully declared, and the great rupture was postponed for one more day. While he lived, everyone could still veil a little longer the truth growing within them. But that veil had grown very thin. Every day of the king's illness left the future of the realm a little more naked. Every feast that no longer took place, every ceremony left unfinished, every stair climbed with difficulty, made one truth more visible. Peace was no longer in order. It was only an interval stretched beyond its natural end. Seen through Rhaenyra's eyes, this waiting must have weighed most heavily upon the love she bore her father. For Viserys was not only the king to her, he was the father who had chosen her, loved her, and left to her not only a crown, but a solitude as heavy as any crown could be. And yet that same father, knowingly or not, had also become the source of the rupture that had been delayed for so many years. So long as he lived, her claim was preserved. So long as he lived, rival hopes continued to breathe as well. This is one of the oldest contradictions in dynastic tragedy. A beloved man cannot bring resolution while he still lives, and yet by living, he does nothing but postpone the disaster. In such times, even a daughter's love can offer no peace, for a person may long for her father to remain alive, even while she can already feel, almost in his very breath, the darkness that will begin the moment he is gone. And the silence truly was becoming something heavier with each passing day. It was no longer the silence of courtesy. It was a hush more akin to the ominous order within nature itself, like the sea drawing back before a storm. In the chambers of the court, people spoke more carefully, letters were written more obliquely, visits took on greater meaning, and absences became more revealing than presence. Everyone was waiting. Perhaps no one said it openly, yet all knew the same thing. When Viserys died, the silence would break. All the sentences held back until then, all the desires withdrawn, all the anger suppressed, would suddenly find their voice. And when that day came, the question would not be only who would wear the crown. The question would be that the mistrust gathering for years in the heart of one house could no longer be hidden. Over all this waiting, there also lay an older shadow coming from far away, a more ancient possibility still living, though its name was not always spoken aloud. In certain chambers of the dynasty at night, that whispered burden that ice and fire would one day meet again, the belief that the Targaryen throne must be preserved not only for power, but for a greater charge. If Viserys truly passed this on to his daughter, then the division drawing near was no longer merely a family tragedy, for the dynasty, instead of preparing for the darkness it might one day have to face, was melting away in a struggle over its own inheritance. What a cruel irony that was. The blood of dragons may have carried the ghost of a distant winter within it, but before that winter ever came, that blood would wound itself first. Thus, the third phase passed in just this way, in those long years of pressure when the rupture had not yet fully come, yet everyone could already feel its inevitability. The farther Rhaenyra moved from the Red Keep, the more she became a center that was both more independent and more alone. The bond she forged with Daemon strengthened her, yet at the same time made the division all the sharper. The blacks and the greens no longer stood merely as rival tendencies within the court, but had begun to look like the names of wars yet to come. And at the center of it all, Viserys, in his decaying body, still went on living as the last bond holding the realm together. That is why the deepest sound of those years was not anger, it was waiting, a heavy, cold, irreversible waiting, for everyone was silent around the same truth. When the king died, the family would come apart, and for a dynasty, there are few griefs more bitter than that, to be shattered not by foreign enemies, but because the love within it could no longer become trust. At last, the waiting came to an end, and when it ended, the heavy silence that had long settled over the realm did not break apart at once. It first took on a darker, more suffocating shape. When King Viserys I died, it was not only a ruler who passed from the world, the last while still holding together a house that no longer trusted itself was extinguished as well. Every intention delayed until that hour, every hidden calculation, every desire left half unspoken, found new life around his deathbed, and history, once again, showed that its most ruinous fractures do not always begin with a cry, but with decisions made behind closed doors. For after Viserys, the realm moved not by law, but by haste, not by loyalty, but by fear, not by openness, but by accomplished fact. So it was with Aegon's coronation. It was not merely the proclamation of a new king. It was the quiet overturning of oaths sworn years before, of words once spoken, of a father's will. The Iron Throne was not first taken from Rhaenyra through open war. It was stolen from her. The court moved, while the warmth of the dead had not yet fully withdrawn from the walls. News was withheld, doors were shut, loyalties were tested. Those who hesitated were crushed, and those who acted swiftly were rewarded. And Aegon was proclaimed king in the very center of the order once promised to his sister. When the crown was placed upon his head, something as old as the iron of the throne itself was confirmed once more. When it came to the right to rule, the realm still recoiled from the legitimacy of a woman. That is why the coronation was not only a political choice, but the unveiling of thoughts long concealed. The truth that had waited for years behind courteous language was no longer ashamed to show its face. The news that reached Dragonstone brought Rhaenyra not only the death of her father, but the knowledge that her world had once again been torn from its place. And as though that grief alone were not enough, the tidings of mourning also brought death into her own body. Little Visenya, born too soon amid sorrow and fury, slipped away before she could fully take hold of life. In such hours, no human heart feels only one thing: grief, betrayal, bodily pain, anger, denial, humiliation, fear, all come at once, knotting themselves into something dark and difficult to untangle within the soul. In those days, Rhaenyra was likely less a queen than a mother, a daughter, an heir, a wounded body, struggling to breathe beneath identities being stripped from her, one after another. But the fate of dynasties seldom allows much space for private grief. Before the tears have even dried, the crown calls again. That is why her coronation on Dragonstone feels less like a moment of triumph than the acceptance of a heavy necessity. There, amid the roar of the sea and the ancient silence of black stone, Rhaenyra did not merely proclaim her right, she declared to the world that she would not surrender it. The crown set upon her head bore all at once her father's will, the right of her blood, the future of her children, and the burning memory of the wrong that had been done to her. The moment she was crowned by Daemon's hands may well have been the moment the civil war of the dynasty truly began. But within Rhaenyra herself, something else had already begun. She was no longer only an heir who had been deprived of her due. She was becoming a will hardened by grief, and a will hardened by grief often begins to blur the line between the pursuit of justice and the desire for vengeance. The unity of the realm, even if it continued to live on in name after that moment, collapsed in spirit, for the two sides were no longer merely opposing interpretations of the same house. Each had become a separate sense of destiny, seeing the very existence of the other as fatal to its own future. The realm had come to a place where mothers feared for their children, where brothers no longer regarded one another as rightful, where old friendships were forced to choose a side, and where even the bloodline of dragons had begun to be read in the language of politics. And once that threshold is crossed, no word remains wholly innocent. Envoys may go forth for peace and still carry threat within them. Oaths may call for loyalty and still deepen the possibility of betrayal. Even silence ceases to be emptiness and becomes instead the weight of the blow that is coming. The realm was no longer a single body. It had become two fires fed by the same blood, and when fire draws too near to fire, it burns far more often than it gives light. The death of Lucerys was the irreversible moment that revealed the true face of this civil war. Before that, there may still have been some who believed that everything could remain confined to a great display of pressure, to the calculated use of threats, to the forcing of lords back into line. But when a sun dies beneath a storm-dark sky, when one dragon tears another apart, when the news a mother waits for arrives as broken wings and hopes drowned in the sea, war ceases to be a possibility. Lucerys was not merely an envoy. He was Rhaenyra's child. In his mother's eyes, he was still a face, still growing, still a life that might yet be protected. With his death, this struggle ceased to be a war of maps and councils. It became a war of children. This was the moment when blood openly turned against blood. History can never fully tell what such a wound becomes within a mother's heart. The records will note the roads armies marched, the hour when one lord changed sides, the moment when one castle fell, but they cannot truly measure the silent darkening that passes through a woman left alone with herself at night. Even so, it is no exaggeration to say that Rhaenyra was no longer the same person. After that moment, the death of Lucerys turned the injuries long gathering within her into something darker still. The world had not merely wronged her anymore. It had begun to devour her children as well. In such a place, tenderness begins to withdraw. Trust grows narrow. A person starts to see betrayal in every glance and the possibility of a new disaster in every piece of news. And when the queen hardened, it was not ambition alone that lived within that hardness. Grief lived there too. And the losses did not stop. Once the war became real, no bond of family could soften it anymore. On the contrary, each death tore another piece from the body of the dynasty itself. Every new report narrowed Rhaenyra's world a little further. Her allies died, her hopes diminished, the circle around her children drew tighter, and the faces she could trust grew fewer. And when a person is made to lose again and again, that does not always make her stronger. Sometimes it only makes her seem more like stone. Such a change began to emerge in Rhaenyra as well. From the radiant young girl once called the realm's delight, what remained was a more closed, sharper, less forgiving ruler, defending a right now under siege. And as her judgments hardened, even those who stood beside her must at times have begun to sense that the figure ascending the throne was not shaped by claim alone, but by the form her grief had taken. And yet war does not move according to some order in which the one who suffers must always remain the one who loses. In time, the gates were opened, the reckonings shifted, and Rhaenyra at last entered King's Landing. From the outside, it seemed the long-denied center had finally been reclaimed. She was returning now to the capital, the city of her childhood. But a return does not always mean coming home. Not when that home has, over the years, cast you out, rejected you in spite of your name, and become a place shaped not for you, but against you. Rhaenyra entered King's Landing not as a conqueror drunk on triumph, but as one who had paid in blood to reclaim what was hers by right. Yet, in such returns, the face of victory is never bright, for even when a city receives you, the echo of its old betrayals continues to live beneath the stones. When she drew near to the Iron Throne, the thing once promised to her had at last come within the reach of her hands. But why, in that moment, did victory bring her no peace? Because it had come too late. Because the road that led to that throne was strewn with the grief of children, with broken oaths, burned castles, divided kin, and dead dragons. Because to seize a kingdom is not the same as making it governable, repairable, or worthy of trust again. When Rhaenyra entered the capital, she did not simply take possession of an office. She inherited the weight of a world hollowed out within, its treasury strained, its hearts filled with fear, its loyalties shattered. And perhaps the bitterest truth of all was this: even that weight did not lighten the justice of her cause. A person may be in the right and still find that what finally comes into her hands is not peace, but ruin. And so her victory began to feel like anything but victory, for perhaps she had gained what she had long sought, but not in the form she had once desired. The crown promised to her in childhood seemed, along the road that led to it, to have changed its shape, to have grown colder, harder, and steeped in the scent of blood. It no longer carried only the right to rule. It also carried the constant reminder of all she had lost. That is why Rhaenyra's hardness was not merely political. It was a defense of the soul as well. When a person has lost too much, she may no longer truly wish to govern. She may wish only never again to surrender anything that has been taken from her. And though such a feeling can make the one upon the throne appear strong, inwardly it leaves her all the more alone. And this was the truth of the fourth phase. Fire had begun to feed upon its own blood. Grief had not remained only as tears. It had turned into command, punishment, suspicion, and distance. Rhaenyra reclaimed her right, yes, but when she reclaimed it, she found a world already left in ruins. That is why her entry into the capital feels not like a conclusion, but like the beginning of another kind of collapse. For some victories do not bring peace. They merely change the shape loss takes upon a throne. And by that point, Rhaenyra Targaryen was no longer the radiant heir of her youth, but a queen shaped by suffering, a queen for whom even what she had won could offer no comfort, a queen upon whose shoulders the full weight of the crown had at last come to rest. Yet, beneath that weight, she carried not peace, but ash alone. And then the collapse began, not all at once, and not like some loud ruin, but as though a structure long cracked had finally become unable to bear its own weight. Rhaenyra had entered King's Landing as a queen reclaiming what was rightfully hers. Yet, it did not take long for her to see how deep the chasms were between sitting a throne and ruling, between ruling and inspiring trust, between inspiring trust and being loved. Even if the capital seemed to kneel before her, the city no longer truly belonged to her, or rather, it no longer possessed a spirit strong enough to belong wholly to any ruler. The wounds opened by the long war, the emptied treasuries, fear settling into the common tongue, even bread itself becoming political, the discontent swelling behind closed doors. All of it had turned the Iron Throne into less a seat of power than the cold center of a world collapsing inward. And when Rhaenyra at last came to hold the thing she had long and justly desired, she found that what awaited her there was not splendor, but exhaustion. When a person has been kept outside for too long, she continues to carry the marks of that exclusion even after she is finally allowed within. So it was with Rhaenyra. The theft of her birthright, the loss of her son, the years of diminishment and suspicion she had endured, these had not only hardened her, they had also left behind a deep mistrust. No face around her could any longer offer complete safety. Loyalty itself must often have seemed to her delayed, conditional, or fragile. And once a queen begins to doubt everyone around her, the court ceases to be a place of shelter. Every corridor carries the possibility of another betrayal, every counselor another hidden calculation, every silence a judgment being kept out of sight. In such times, a person begins to suspect not only her enemies, but the weariness of her own side as well. For that is the bitterest truth of civil war. Even the side that wins is never left wholly intact. It begins to carry within itself a buried decay. That is why Rhaenyra's downfall was not merely a military or political decline. She fell first by growing estranged from the world around her, then by withdrawing into the solitude within herself, and then by allowing her judgments to take on forms ever heavier, more fearful, more defensive. The anger of the people swelled. The city began to remember her queenship, not with hope, but with deepening fear and weariness. The losses continued. The dragons diminished. The people she had trusted fell away one by one. Some died, some withdrew, and and some, in the very darkest hour, chose their own path instead. The strength of a ruler is often measured by armies, but true power lies in whether there are still hearts around her that believe. And as the circle around Rhaenyra drew tighter and tighter, her holding more fiercely to the throne did not make her safer. On the contrary, it left her all the more alone. And in the end, the retreat came, to be forced to withdraw from the very capital she had once marched upon to reclaim her birthright, must have seemed to her not merely a defeat, but one of fate's heaviest ironies. For what she carried with her as she left King's Landing was not fear alone. It was a great weariness, a broken will, a diminished world, and a heart that now bore the losses of the past wherever it turned. It was not only a queen who was retreating. With her, the old promise that had once shone in Viserys' eyes was retreating too. The life that had begun as the realm's delight had now narrowed into a path woven of ash and silence. There were still those beside her who remained loyal, certainly, but loyalty is not the same thing as hope. In many wars, hope is the last thing to die. In the dance of the dragons, it had often died before sword or flame ever struck. That is why her return to Dragonstone feels not like a homecoming, but like the closing of a circle. The black island that had once become the center of her life received her again at the end, but now in another kind of silence. The place that had once been a refuge had become the final station of retreat. The sea was the same sea, the wind the same salt-heavy wind, the stones perhaps the same old stones, but no one returns to the same place as the same person. Not after losing children, friends, trust, and nearly the whole order of the world in between. Rhaenyra returned to Dragonstone as a queen, yes, but not with the power of one still secure upon her throne. She returned as a ruler narrowed by fate, exposed to betrayal and worn to the edge of exhaustion. For at the final step of a collapse, betrayal is often present, no less than the enemy, and she did not escape that truth either. Dragonstone was the oldest seat of House Targaryen, yet even the oldest strongholds do not remain safe at the end of war. Doors are opened from within, loyalties shift under the weight of gold, fear, or weariness, and even the most ancient places can no longer protect the one to whom they belong. Rhaenyra's capture was, in one sense, the bitterest symbol of her whole story. The woman who had spent her life defending her own right, struggling to keep her own legitimacy standing, was at last taken amid the very stones borne by her own house as one of the final victims of her bloodline's division. This was not merely a military defeat. It was the sign that the dynasty could no longer trust even its own roots. And then the end came. In that moment when she was brought before Hagon II, all the darkness of the civil war gathered into a single image. The struggle of siblings who had once laid claim to the same throne was now ending with a woman being sent to her death before the eyes of her own son. The death before Sunfire may remain in the chronicles as an execution, but the meaning it carried runs far deeper than that. For it was not only Rhaenyra who died there. There, too, the last shadow of a promise once given by a king to his daughter was cast into the fire. There, too, Viserys' choice, the price Aemma had paid, the old joy of childhood. The oaths sworn on the day she was named heir, all the defenses of her motherhood, her struggle to protect her sons, and the sense of right that had stood at the center of all her suffering, all of it came to an end in a single ominous scene. When a dynasty consumes its own daughter, its own blood, before the fire of its own dragon, that is not the sign of power, but of decay. And perhaps nowhere in Targaryen history did that house wound itself so nakedly as it did there. That is why Rhaenyra's death was not merely the end of a queen, but the sundering of memory itself. To those who loved her, she remained the rightful ruler whose claim had been stolen, the heir chosen by her father, the woman who did not bow before cruelty and betrayal, a figure hardened by the grief of her children, and yet unwilling to yield to injustice. To those who rejected her, she was remembered as a queen who had fed the flames of civil war, and who, through her severity and suspicion, helped bring about her own ruin. But history often carries a silence greater than the language used by either side, and within that silence, Rhaenyra's life endures as the story of how the mere approach of a woman to the throne could awaken the fears of an entire order, how a beloved princess, a rightful heir, could in the end be left alone beneath the shadow of the war gathered around her own name. Perhaps she never truly reigned. Perhaps even when the crown was in her hands, she never found peace. Yet her life revealed, with painful clarity, Westeros's deep unease with female rule, the ease with which dynastic love could be sacrificed to politics, and the speed with which the bonds of family could collapse before the fear of succession. The Dance of the Dragons may perhaps be said to have ended with her death, but the wound dealt to the dynasty did not close there. Even if the Targaryens could claim victory in the war, in truth, they had shattered the very foundation of their own strength. The dragons diminished. The blood grew weaker. Trust collapsed. The power that had once filled the skies was now diminished within itself. The proud certainty of the dynasty never truly returned in its old form. For some wars do not cost a realm its lands, they cost it its soul. The Dance of the Dragons was such a calamity. The Iron Throne remained where it had always stood. Yes, the crown still rested upon Targaryen heads, but the generations that came after ruled over the invisible wreckage left behind by those who had gone before them. From that day onward, the dynasty was forced to live not only against its outer enemies, but against the ghosts of its own past as well. Perhaps this is where the truest meaning of Rhaenyra's story lies. She is not merely a fallen queen. She is the living memory of how a dynasty wounded itself. She is the bitter mirror of a house that could not preserve the love within itself, that could name a right openly and still fail to secure it, that sought to make its children the guarantee of the future, only to turn them into the future's victims. When we look upon her life, we do not see only the rise and fall of a woman. We also see that ancient tension between crown and blood, the way a family, in trying to become a state, can lose its humanity, and the way dragons can scorch their own nest with their own fire. And so, at the very end of the story, what remains is not only a scene of death, but a long echo. A king, when he once placed the crown in his daughter's path, may have believed he was securing his house. Perhaps he wished to preserve a greater future. Perhaps he believed that the fire had to endure against the darkness of ice. But that bloodline tore itself apart before it could ever protect the realm. The line that was meant to preserve the fire burned its own house first, and so the memory of Rhaenyra Targaryen lives on with that sorrowful truth which still moves quietly through the nights of Westeros. Sometimes what destroys a dynasty is not the darkness that comes from without. Sometimes that darkness wakes much earlier within its own blood.